Friday, it's the AWS Developers Podcast. We are talking about Identity Center. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are on this planet. Welcome to the AWS Developers Podcast. Today, with two hosts, because I have the immense pleasure to welcome Brooke Jamison, your developer advocate, and you are a very well-known voice in the AWS Developers Podcast because you used to co-host it with Dave. So thank you for being there, Brooke, and welcome. I'm happy to be with you, to not be alone, to present this episode. This episode is about Identity Center with two special guests. We have on one side Joseph de Klerk, your consultant for ProServe, and Roberto Migli, your solution architect. We're going to talk about Identity Center, what it means for developer. What is this AWS service called Identity Center?
Yeah, so thank you, Seb and Brooke. So it's very nice and great to be here. First time on a podcast, so let's make sure that it's a good one. Okay, yeah. So, Identity Center, actually, we're going to talk about also a bit of the history of it, but was designed to solve one challenge, which is about managing what we call workforce identity access in AWS. So that's very important to frame it. What is workforce identity? Yep. What do we mean by workforce identity, right? And for us, it's really humans. So humans like me and like Roberto or you, Seb, that are required to access AWS, to access an account, also to work, interact with any AWS-based application.
But there is already a service doing that. It's IAM, Identity and Access Manager. I used to learn that we can create user and roles there. So what's the difference?
Exactly. So of course, IAM, it's the way that you define authorization into AWS. Like you can define what we call a principal can do in AWS. And that could be, of course, a machine. That could be a human as well. But Identity Center is really designed to really build around the concept of workforce identity, really humans, okay? And of course, Identity Center works as a bridge also to use IAM roles. We cannot talk about that. That's one of the main capabilities. That's why at the beginning it was called SSO, single sign-on.
Yeah, this actually came up when I was researching for this episode because it said IDC on the doc, and I thought there was some sort of new service, but no, it turns out I had just still been calling it AWS SSO this whole time. So if you were also confused as a listener, this is why. I think it was renamed about 2 years ago, is that correct?
Yes, it was renamed 2 years ago from AWS Single Sign-On. And AWS Single Sign-On initial goal was to be able to manage all the human user access to a fleet of AWS accounts. So when you're an organization, you're using AWS organization to manage multiple AWS accounts. Previously, you had to manage IAM roles and IAM user in every AWS accounts. And when AWS Single Sign-On was launched, it was able to provision your IAM roles in every AWS account with standard permission sets.
Actually, in the docs, there's a very handy table in the IAM docs that talks about the rename. And this is what I think all renamed products should have. And it has the legacy term and the current term and a mapping across this. Yes. Thank you to whoever wrote these docs. It's very handy.
Single sign-on for employees, what you call, Roberto, workforce. That's how we design the employees of an enterprise.
Yes, and it's very important what you said about being on the enterprise. So usually it's people that belong to the organization. Like also, let's reuse the term that there's a strong link with the AWS organization, of course, Identity Center. But yeah, they belong to the same company usually. Then there are some edge cases that I think we're going to cover a bit later. But
so we are not talking about the end user of application. If I'm building an application that I deploy on AWS and I expect that application to receive, 50,000 happy customer connecting on a daily basis, of course, these identities are not managed by Identity Center. That's correct?
You could have 50,000 employees, by the way, but so Joseph, please.
Could be more for an Amazon Cognito use case if it's a customer or B2C use case. So you have a web application deployed for anyone consuming it publicly. You might use Amazon Cognito as the user directory for this use case. IAM Identity Center was more designed initially for managing your employee access to AWS accounts. And since we were discussing the changing of the name, I think it's also aligned with the changing of the offering. So IAM Identity Center progressively onboarded more features, such as provide access to I would say enterprise applications, and further on with integrating with end user AWS applications such as Amazon SageMaker Studio or Amazon Q more recently. So you would give access to your employee to this AWS service.
That's what I was about to say. Not all employees inside an organization needs to have access to AWS account. It's only the employees either that have to manage the infrastructure, other employees that access like higher level application, like end user application. Maybe I'm thinking about QuickSight, or you mentioned Amazon Q for business. So that's the type of employees identity that we need to replicate inside Identity Center. Did I understand correctly?
Yes.
The two voices together. Yes.
No, just one thing that it's very important that has to be a clear understanding that accessing application and accessing AWS accounts are two different use cases. I guess probably that's where we are going.
And we are going to explain that into the details.
How would you explain this to someone? So I meet so many developers who make hobby projects themselves and then really want to get one of these big enterprise jobs where it's something that they would be using Identity Center. How would you explain the shift in thinking that they'll need to have in order to be successful with any of the Identity Center work that they might be doing in their new dream job?
Yeah, so again, let's assume we're talking about someone they starting today. As you know, first of all, AWS is strong advocate of using multiple accounts, also for small activities, because it's a very good way to provide segregation, right? And so Identity Center is the tool of choice if you were starting today to manage access to those accounts. So let's say you are a developer and you want to access the development account and you want to access the production account. And of course, you probably want to have very different authorization for both. Then Identity Center, it's what you're going to use today, right? Then there is, of course, the second use case, which is really about application access. Like, as you mentioned, Brooke, for instance, let's say that even a small organization, right? You organize with developers, you have someone that does more infrastructure stuff and some other developers that are still more on the development side. They are not really into the infrastructure part of things. So they don't really require access to an AWS account. At the same time, you want to give them a tool, for instance, Amazon Q Developer, which is the tool to support developers to use GenAI to help them code faster and in a more secure fashion. And for that, you need to give them access to the tool, right? And you don't need to use IAM for that. So you just need to say, okay, I want this person to be allowed to have, I don't know, as this subscription level to Amazon Q Developer Professional. You apply for the subscription, and the user uses the toolkit of his choice through his or their ID to access the Amazon Q Developer, and that's it. So the developer will never have actually an access to an AWS account, but he can still consume the service of Amazon Q Developer.
Okay, let's try to be clear on the account access on one side, application access on the other side. Are the two mutually exclusive, or can I use one and not the other? Or
yeah, you don't need to use both features. So as Roberto was mentioning, you can use IAM Identity Center only to provide access to AWS applications such as Code Catalyst or Q Developer or Q Business application. And at the same time, you could use IAM Identity Center only to provide access to your AWS accounts. Oh, and you can also join the two. And so in the same IAM Identity Center, you will have your user base, your entire user base, employees, for example, and you will, for some user, manage them into groups and provide them access to AWS accounts when they are developers or AWS account administrators. And for some others, you will just let's say just developer, they will have access to Amazon Q Developers features.
So what's the workflow? I'm a developer in charge of the account for my company, a small company. Where do I start?
It really depends on where you are at the stage. But there are multiple scenarios, right? You don't use Identity Center at all, and you want to have a way to access AWS accounts, and you are relying on something that you shouldn't use anymore unless you really have a good reason, but I can't think of one, which is IAM users. Then you need to activate in your organization what we call an organization level instance, and you bring in your identities. And we're going to discuss it just a bit later about how we bring those identities into Identity Center. And then you start to define what every person is allowed to do in what account. So what roles are they allowed to assume in every specific account they want to work with through what we call permission sets. Okay. If you already have if you already have an organization level identity, organization instance of Identity Center, but you want to, for instance, experiment with specific applications, like let's say you're building a custom application that integrates with the Identity Center, then you can also use what we call an account instance of Identity Center, which is ideal for testing environment. So that you as a developer, you have your own account, which you have a great degree of autonomy, let's say a sandbox account, but you don't want to you don't want to affect the central account where there is the organization instance, which, can handle pretty sensitive operations. You want to keep it segregated while you will launch an account instance of Identity Center, and you start from that. Very important, you cannot do permission sets in account level instances. So you cannot manage AWS account.
So I create the Identity Center at the account level. It might be at the organization level or in a sub-account if I want to segregate a subgroup of user. And I start to add identities. And in the most simple form, if I understand correctly, I enter that by hand, like first name, last name, email address. That's how I enter an identity in the most basic form. Are we on the same page?
Yes, but that's the way to start. Joseph, maybe you want to say that how we go better into more production-like.
Yeah, I asked Amazon Q what a permission set in AWS IAM Identity Center is, and I'm going to read the answer to you, and I would like to hear if you can confirm or deny. So, a permission set in AWS IAM Identity Center is a template that defines a collection of IAM policies which specify the level of access for users and groups within your organization to AWS accounts and resources. When assigned to an AWS account, IAM Identity Center creates corresponding IAM roles and attaches the specified policies, allowing users to access AWS services through the AWS Access Portal or AWS CLI. Permission sets can include various types of IAM policies and a permissions boundary. Can you confirm or deny? Okay, great job, Amazon Q. Yeah.
That's cool. We have 3 hosts on this podcast. We have Amazon Q as well.
I'll give it a little thumbs up on their response to say it was good. This is a good sign. Are there any big pitfalls that developers might fall into or that's common? I know, Joseph, you said you worked in ProServe, so I used to work in consulting too. I know you've probably seen some things out in the wild. Do you have any pitfalls that you can save the developers listening from?
Yes. So a few things to pay attention to when you are launching your first IAM Identity Center instance. It must be the organization instance that you launch first. And once it's deployed, you deploy it in one single region. And it will affect other services that you will use in your organization. So if you're an enterprise customer, you're most likely using Control Tower to manage your AWS account. Control Tower must be in the same AWS region as IAM Identity Center, for example. And these are fundamental building blocks for enterprise. So once you made the choice of the region you want to be homed, I would say, it's hard to change it because you would have to delete your Control Tower environment. You would have to delete the IAM Identity Center instance. It will delete the user base, and then you will have to recreate everything in a new AWS region if you wanted to migrate from one region to another. So it's a building block. It's at the foundation of your AWS accounts and AWS organization. So it requires some careful thoughts before setting it up.
Oh, that seems like a strong one-way door. So we need to think about in which region I'm going to create that identity center. A one-way door, sorry, it's an Amazon jargon. It's a decision that is not easy to revert back. What is the consequence if we create an identity center in the wrong or in the incorrect region? There are some service we cannot access or some scenario that will not work.
Yes, there are some services which require, like when you use the integration with Identity Center, they will require to use the same region. And so like what's the best choice here is really to look at what services today you need to use of what you're planning to use in the near term, and do your like adjust your decision based on that as well. But of course, also like we are moving also forward to enable ways to allow cross region, which you control. For instance, for Amazon Q Business, we just released that capability back in July. So now customers that have accounts in different regions between Amazon Q Business and Identity Center have not to worry about. They can enable cross-region access on demand when they create an application.
And I guess it makes sense for very large enterprise that have employees all around the world that are deploying across multiple regions. They must be able to use AWS applications in different regions, even if there is only one identity center.
Absolutely,
somewhere.
absolutely. Maybe if I may, just also one other, I wouldn't say pitfall, but common scenario that we see happening with the Identity Center is depending very much on the kind of organization we are looking at. Like, there is many kind of organization we work with, but you might have a scenario which you have multiple identity providers. So we didn't talk about yet how we integrate identities into Identity Center, because it's very important to mention that you don't need to use Identity Center as a golden source for identities, but it's very important to mention that Identity Center supports one identity provider as a source. So if you have multiple identity providers, you need to have a way to aggregate those and then synchronize those to Identity Center, as you cannot do this in Identity Center.
And how customers are doing that typically, to aggregate multiple identity providers and then expose only one to Identity Center?
So there are some identity providers that allow to do just that, because you have to think about complexity of this, because you don't want to end up with multiple identities that represent the same human, because that will be really bad from multiple perspectives, from a governance perspective, from a security perspective. You don't want to end up right? So you need to have a way that aggregates and collects this information correctly with rules that are very clear, and there are some identity providers out there that they can do that.
And that's a great segue to the next section, where I want to talk about identity provider, because a few minutes ago I said quite naively that the easiest way to start is to enter the identities one by one, first name, last name, email. But of course, that's not how enterprises are operating. Enterprises have already identity directories. Might be an Active Directory, might be Okta or some type of third-party identity provider. And you mentioned that it used to be called single sign-on. So I guess Identity Center integrates with these.
Yes, indeed. So I think one of the features of IAM Identity Center, it's user and group directory. So you could use the console to create, or the API to create users and groups. And people will log into the IAM Identity Center access portal, enter their credentials and login. That would be the first way. And then you can bring on a SAML integration. So if you have a SAML compliant identity provider, you can plug it into IAM Identity Center. So user, instead of entering their credentials in the SSO portal, they will log into their identity provider first, and then they will be redirected to the SSO portal. But it still remains the questions of how do you manage the user? Do you still create them manually? And in this case, you can enable Scheme. I don't remember the acronym exactly, but it's a standard to provision identities within systems. So it's a common set.
System for cross-domain identity management. I just Google it. I don't know that.
So SCIM.
But that's the idea. And that's the synchronization between a third-party directory and an identity center.
Yeah, exactly. So the third-party directory can invoke APIs. It's a REST API that is standard across multiple identity providers. So many are capable of publishing user assigned to an application into the application using SCIM.
What is the workflow for end user when configuring such an identity provider? I'm an end user. I want to access the AWS account for development. Where do I go?
So if you are talking about starting, let's say you created your organization level, your organization instance of Identity Center. Now you want to enable importing the identities from your source identity provider. Well, it depends highly on what kind of identity provider you're talking about. The documentation tries to provide really step-by-step guides for the most common ones. So usually it's Scheme that is used, which is supported by multiple multiple common identity providers, like as you mentioned before, Okta or Ping Identity, or Ping Federate, among others, or Enter ID, for instance, which is very common today. It's a bit different if you're using Active Directory. It doesn't use scheme, it uses another way to integrate. So when you start the flow of integrating, you select between are you using AD, are you using a scheme-enabled identity provider, or are you building a custom integration? So depending on that, the UI will guide you through the setup of the scheme part to import the identities and groups.
But that's the admin setup. My question was more about the end user. I'm the end user, I'm the developer. I know there is an identity center set up for my organization and I want to connect the AWS developer account. Where do I start?
Right. So sorry about that. So usually the identity, like the person, the people of the organization who set up that integration will provide you an URL that usually is integrated into another portal. In large organization, you have an authentication portal that uses as a common entry point from which you select the Identity Center application in this case, and you click. If you are not logged in already, usually there is the login flow that happens before. You do the login, so username, password, probably an MFA or so, or a one-time password. And then you move into the Identity Center UI, which basically, if you're talking about AWS account access, so as I'm a developer, you're going to be asked, like, first of all, we're going to see from what was configured for you, what accounts and permission sets you are associated with. And so we're going to enumerate those to you. So you can choose to say, okay, I want to access right now, I need to access this account with the role read-only. I don't know, I want to do some kind of operations on there.
And that works from the CLI as well.
And that works for the CLI as well. I was about to mention that part. Of course, the CLI will start an authentication flow if that it was not done already, so that you authenticate with the identity provider. And then there is some form of exchange. We're not going to get into the detail of how this technically happens. But at the end of the day, we end up with a set of credentials, basically, that are temporary credentials. That's very, very important. That I really want to highlight this one as a main difference with IAM users. The credentials that are, the IAM credentials that are vended by Identity Center are always temporary. You choose how long they last. They're never unlimited length. They expire at a given time. That is set up in Identity Center and depends on the role that you are showing.
So they are limited in time, but they are limited in scope as well. They are attached to an IAM role that limits the permission that you can get.
Yes.
Yeah. So it seems like there's lots of different things that you'll have to make choices along the way when setting this up. And we did talk about one-way and two-way door decisions earlier. So one-way door decisions, like we said, you can't really go back on. Are there any really important decisions when you're configuring and setting this up that you wish more people knew about so you can save them from themselves?
Those are not easy questions. So Joseph got the first one. Maybe I get this time. I get it. So if you're talking about identity, so the identity provider, changing identity provider, we provide documentation for that because it does happen. It sounds like unlikely, but we see that happening, unfortunately, situations in which there is a migration of identity provider. And so we try to give you every customers a very detailed way to understand what happens when you change from one IDP to another. And it depends really if it's, for instance, from AD to a SAML-based integration, and depends on some different identity providers. So really look at the documentation specific for that one. It's really, really important. In terms of access, fortunately, that's easy. Like what we see is that customers iterate a lot about defining what kind of roles do we want to give to the people that want to access the accounts. That's really easy in a sense. Like usually you start with basic stuff like a read-only access role, a very highly privileged role, especially for sandbox account, and maybe you have kind of 5-4 standard roles. And then evolving, maybe you're gonna start to think about, okay, but I want to have my data engineers, they want to have a specific role for them, permission set for them. So now you create a specific permission set. But again, here we are really focusing only on AWS account access.
And maybe in what you just said, Roberto, one key aspect that is very a benefit of IAM Identity Center and permission set is you can iterate and change the permissions, and they will be redeployed across all your AWS accounts. So previously, you would have to go to every AWS accounts to update the IAM permissions that you want to assign to an IAM role. Now you can do it centrally, and you can keep track centrally. So easier to manage and operate.
So talking about the one-way door, the thing to pay attention before starting using start to use Identity Center, we talk about Identity Center is deployed in one region, and it might impact some application that requires the application and the Identity Center to be in the same region. Sorry. We mentioned connecting to external IDP. What if I have multiple IDPs? Like I have an Active Directory for my employees, and I'm also using Okta because I just acquired another company, and I have multiple source of identities.
I'm so excited you asked about acquisitions. This was going to be my next thing. So, because so many of these things sound great on paper, and then you talk to people who work at companies that just like keep doing endless M&A work, which is mergers and acquisitions, if I'm saying too many acronyms. But yes, I think this is where it really gets a bit spicy. So I am very excited to see it.
Yeah. So right now, IAM Identity Center only support one source identity provider. So you would have to select your identity provider of choice and aggregate all the identities in it before being able to give access to your employees.
So the solution comes outside of AWS. You need to use some kind of either proxy IDP, either an IDP able to aggregate multiple source and then expose that one to Identity Center.
Another option, which it's a bit more lengthy, if you will, it's of course to build your own integration. Like as Joseph explained, Scheme is a protocol. So nothing prevents you from actually doing your own custom broker that integrates the identities from multiple sources. But I think at this stage would be really a make or buy decision, and it should be very much considered the advantages and trade-off of each one. Like building your own solution versus, as I mentioned, it's not so easy as it looks like. There are many considerations you want to take into account.
We talk a lot about Identity Center as a way to give access to your workforce to AWS accounts or AWS application. As a developer, can I develop an enterprise application that use the same authentication mechanisms, that use Identity Center as the login page for my application? I'm talking about enterprise application, not B2C application here.
So yes, with IAM Identity Center, you can use IAM Identity Center as an identity itself as an identity provider, either SAML-based application. So let's say QuickSites or any enterprise app that supports SAML authentication flow. You can use, in this case, IAM Identity Center as an identity provider.
So you said Samuel. It means if I have a lighter OAuth only web application, it will not work with IDC?
For an OAuth-based application that you developed, IDC is currently not available to be the identity provider. It's an identity provider only for AWS applications using the OAuth flow. Okay,
so all I need to do with code, of course, because there's a lot to do, is to support Samuel, SAML, as an authentication flow in my enterprise application.
Yes, for now, yes.
For WAF, there is, of course, like as Joseph explained, is like the flow doesn't start from Identity Center. WAF integration is something that we added last year, which allows for some very cool use cases that basically are like ones where the end user actually doesn't need always to interact with the Identity Center directly. And so basically you authorize with your identity provider, which is integrated into, there is some form of connection with the Identity Center so that we can map the user that is authenticated in the source identity provider with a user in Identity Center. And through the WAF protocol, we can give access to the person to a specific AWS service. Okay, and so this is a way that we really bridge human access to AWS applications. And that's really a new cool and interesting space.
And maybe I should have mentioned why I want to do that, because you mentioned that IDC distribute temporary access key, secret key that are limited in time and in scope. And if my enterprise application use other AWS resource such as an S3 bucket or DynamoDB, that's a safe way for me to acquire temporary credentials in my enterprise application.
If you have if you have time to maybe very quickly through an example, because I mean, if it's developers, I think they're gonna like a more concrete example, right? Like something together with Joseph we worked on it, and we saw it happening multiple times now. It's developers, they want to build custom applications, like an Amazon Q Business application that is integrated into a UI that already has their own authentication flow. It could be something completely independent from AWS console. Like think about, I don't know, you have a CRM that you build, a custom CRM, okay, where you have already your UI with all the interfaces, and now you want to add GenAI capabilities. Like you want to say, okay, I want to interact with the information that is available on the page. So you develop kind of a widget, and you want this widget to respond as if it were an Amazon Q Business application. So now you need to build the integration with Amazon Q Business. But Amazon Q Business is designed to be used as humans, right? Like I am Roberto, and when interacting with documents, like I'm asking questions about a knowledge base that I have access to, which in this case could be, again, the CRM we are working on. To build that kind of integration, use what we call trusted identity propagation, which basically bridges through OAuth the identity of the person that is connected to the CRM to Amazon Q Business. And that doesn't work, like that. There is very little interaction from the user perspective with IAM itself, but Amazon Q Business can understand who's the human that is making the request. Okay, and so there is a way that now Amazon Q Business can say, oh, it's Roberto, he's asking me, so here's the history of the conversation he had with this application, and here is the, like, once I select a specific conversation, there is the history of my communication. Now, if Joseph connects, it's Joseph conversation. It's not going to be Roberto conversation. We don't want them to overlap, right?
Yeah, it also allows to map specific user to the AWS application. So the developer are not obliged to map to generic roles. It means in terms of auditing and compliance, they can actually find who was the person behind the keyboard and not just know that it's the chat user role, for example.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the main feature of trusted identity propagation. You can see the identities and you can propagate the identities between the AWS API calls downstream.
And if you're curious about trusted identity propagation, just wait for a few weeks. There will be another episode entirely dedicated to trusted identity propagation.
This is a wildcard question, but it's something I really like to ask teams that don't get a lot of time in the limelight. What is your favorite docs page that you either send to people a lot or you think more people should read? Because there's really great docs, like I said earlier with the table of things, but I've been going through the docs as we've been preparing for this. Is there a specific section? Like there's so much here. There's even like different things about how to manage different access. Even there's a whole section on resiliency design and security. Do you have any plugs that you would like to send our listeners to?
Again, I think we covered very much about account access. What I want really to avoid that people overlook is the application access part. So maybe we're going to take a parenthesis just right after this. But for me, it's very important that people understand also how like Identity Center can become very sensitive in terms of functionality because it gives access to multiple accounts, right? So you definitely want to understand the permissions that are associated with giving those permission sets to end users. So you know, I work a lot on identity space, and for me, one of the key documentation, as you asked for that before, is the service access reference documentation, which is actually not the Identity Center, but it has one page per service, which lists out what permissions and what IAM actions are required to do things on a specific service. And Identity Center, as any other service, has the service access reference, which describes those kind of permission that I really encourage everyone to take a look at when you start designing your security model around this, and you want really to understand, okay, what should I block people from doing in my Identity Center organization account?
Yeah, no, I just opened this up as you were talking. So it goes through actions, resources, and condition keys for AWS services, and I am scrolling, and I am not getting to the bottom of this. There are so many.
Indeed.
That's a bookmark on my. So that's the only page I bookmarked on my laptop for AWS documentation, because as Roberto mentioned, you always go back to service authorization reference if you want to design IAM policy, check which permissions you might be missing for a new application you're developing or something like that.
This is why I asked this question. It's helpful. I love seeing what people have bookmarked. There's so many services at AWS that are very shiny and exciting and people get really jazzed about. And then I think there's a lot of workhorse services that structure so much of the foundation of so many products and companies and things like this. So I would give me an opportunity where IAM Identity Center can be exciting. What are you excited about that's coming up? What are you excited about in terms of how you're seeing people growing into using these services or planning to use them in future? What's really got you excited for the rest of this year and moving into next year?
I've been using IAM Identity Center and previously single sign-on for as long as I remember a service exists. It was very useful for every enterprise customer. And since this year, I think 3 months ago or 4 months ago, now I got started on trusted identity propagation, and it was a bit it's very exciting to see that we can know, so we can now know the end user performing actions on top of AWS API calls and making access decision on it. And it's leveraged a lot of new use cases to have better access to data and AWS services.
Yeah, maybe the scale at which we see Identity Center being used, like we see larger and larger organizations using Identity Center really at massive scale. I'd love to share some numbers. I'm not sure I can, but it's pretty amazing to see the growth that we are seeing, like large organization adopting Identity Center. I understand that sometimes there is this weird feeling about saying, yeah, but I have already my identity provider somewhere else. Why don't I just reference? Like, why do I copy over the identities over to Identity Center? But if you think about it, like the way we described it, it's actually so much easier now to define in an application, like, again, Roberto or the group that belongs, I don't know, this developer group. Me as an autonomy in my AWS account, I can define who has access to what, again, as a human. That's really, for me, a game changer. It simplifies especially data access, which is a very, very cool space.
So as soon as there is more than one person accessing an AWS account, go and configure Identity Center. And of course, for enterprise, you can link it to your trusted source of identity, Okta, Ping, Entrust, Active Directory are the 4 more common, but we support others as well. Thank you, Roberto and Joseph, for your very clear explanation. Thank you, Brooke, for your questions as well. And if you want to dive deeper, stay tuned. Wait a few weeks. There will be another episode on the same podcast with Joseph and someone else, Raphael, talking about trusted identity propagation. It will be in 2 weeks from now. But now, go build.